At 7:24 a.m. on October 25, 1944, Commander Ernest Evans stood on the windswept bridge of the 2,100-ton destroyer USS Johnston, staring across a gray, rising sea at the impossible sight of mast after mast appearing on the northern horizon. Massive black silhouettes of Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers totaling nearly 300,000 tons of steel, including the 72,000-ton Yamato, the largest warship ever built. 45 years old, barely 1 year in command of his first destroyer, 0 major fleet engagements to his name, he was now facing a battle line that could erase his entire task unit with 2 salvos. To his left, 6 escort carriers, little jeep carriers with thin decks and slow aircraft, scrambled to launch planes not armed for ship-to-ship combat. Behind him, hundreds of Marines and soldiers preparing for the Leyte landings depended on these fragile ships for air cover. Ahead of him, 14 Japanese warships accelerated, their 14-inch and 18-1-inch guns already searching for range. The calculations were simple. Johnston could not run, could not hide, and could not survive. And yet, without hesitation, Evans ordered flank speed and turned his small destroyer directly toward the oncoming fleet. Why would a 2,100-ton tin can charge straight into the guns of the most powerful battleship on Earth? And how could a handful of lightly armed ships possibly buy the time needed to save an entire invasion force? By October 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase of desperation, calculation, and irreversible momentum. The United States, having seized the Marianas and established forward airfields for B-29 operations, now turned toward the Philippines, the vital archipelago whose fall had once enabled Japan to dominate Southeast Asia. For Tokyo, the Philippines were more than territory. They were the artery through which oil from the Dutch East Indies flowed. Cut that artery, and the Imperial Navy, already starved of fuel, would suffocate. Thus, the American decision to land on Leyte on October 20th triggered Japan's last, most ambitious naval counterstroke. Operation SHO-1, a sprawling, multi-pronged plan intended to lure American carriers north while powerful surface forces slipped through the central passages to smash the invasion fleet at anchor. The plan hinged on deception. Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, a decoy carrier group with almost no aircraft left, sailed from the north to draw Admiral William Bull, Halsey's Third Fleet away. Meanwhile, the real hammer, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, moved west to east, a massive formation built around the battleships Yamato and Musashi, several heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers. If Kurita could break into Leyte Gulf, he could obliterate the transport ships and supply vessels that sustained over 100,000 American troops ashore. Yet plans on paper rarely matched the chaos of real seas. The Americans, relying on incomplete intelligence and overconfidence in carrier aviation, assumed Kurita's battleships had been battered into retreat after the previous day's airstrikes, which sank Musashi and damaged several cruisers. But while wounded, the center force remained lethal and, crucially, still advancing. At the same time, Halsey, fixated on destroying the last remnants of Japanese carrier power, took all 3 of his fast carrier task groups north in pursuit of Ozawa. In this bold, aggressive move, he inadvertently left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. It was the naval equivalent of leaving the back door open while chasing an intruder out the front. The only American units left near the strait were the Taffys, Task Units 77, 2 and 77. 3 groups of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts designed primarily for air support of ground troops and anti-submarine patrols. Taffy 3, under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, was positioned furthest north, closest to the strait, and therefore directly in the center force's path. The contrast in power between the 2 forces was absurd. Taffy 3's 6 escort carriers could barely make 19 knots and carried Avengers and Wildcats mostly armed for ground strikes or anti-submarine runs. Its 3 destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, were fast and aggressive but lightly armored, their hulls barely capable of deflecting medium-caliber shells. The 4 destroyer escorts were even smaller, with limited speed and firepower. Against submarines or small craft, these ships were effective. Against the largest battleship ever built, they might as well have been fishing boats. The geography of the area amplified the danger. To the east of Taffy, 3 stretched open ocean. To the west, the coastline of Samar rose in long, forested ridges. There was nowhere to maneuver out of range, no islands to hide behind. Leyte Gulf, to the south, was filled with vulnerable transports. If Kurita broke through, the American foothold in the Philippines would be at catastrophic risk. Yet the Americans had no indication that a massive Japanese fleet had already cleared the strait during the night. Taffy 3's radar screens were quiet. Aircraft overhead saw nothing. The sea lay calm under a gray morning sky. That calm shattered just after 6:30, when lookouts on the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay reported strange, tall splashes rising far off the northern horizon, splashes unmistakably caused by battleship-caliber shells. At almost the same moment, Johnston's radar picked up large returns closing fast. Within minutes, spotters recognized the angular pagoda masts of Japanese capital ships. Kurita's center force had found them. Not a carrier task group, not Halsey's battleships, but Taffy 3, the smallest, lightest, and most exposed formation in the American fleet. Their fate, it seemed, was sealed the moment the silhouettes appeared through the mist. The question was not whether they could win. It was whether they could survive long enough to warn the invasion fleet behind them. To understand why a 2,100-ton destroyer would charge a battle line that could erase it in a single hit, the story must shift from strategy to the men who stood at the heart of Taffy 3, most notably Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, captain of USS Johnston. Born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, in 1908, Evans was the son of a father of Native American ancestry, a background that shaped both his sense of identity and his fierce determination never to fail those who depended on him. He entered the Naval Academy at Annapolis in the 1920s, graduated into a fleet that still dreamed of battleship duels, and spent the next decade rotating between destroyers and staff assignments. Those who served under him remembered a man who rarely raised his voice, because he never needed to. His authority came not from theatrics, but from an unwavering, almost stubborn resolve. He did not promise safety, glory, or comfort. Instead, he promised combat. On the day he assumed command of Johnston, Evans stood before his new crew and declared bluntly, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off now." No one stepped off. The men who sailed under him were mostly young, farm boys, factory workers, clerks, and students who had joined the Navy after Pearl Harbor. Many had never seen a battleship, let alone fought one. They learned quickly that Evans demanded precision, discipline, and readiness at all hours. He drilled the crew repeatedly in damage control, torpedo deployment, and emergency maneuvers. He insisted that gun crews practice at night, in storms, and under pressure. He personally oversaw live-fire gunnery during shakedown cruises, pushing his men harder than other destroyer captains dared. Yet his toughness inspired loyalty because he also cared deeply for his crew. When a sailor fell ill, Evans was often the first to visit him. When a young gunner made a mistake during training, Evans corrected him without humiliation. He believed a destroyer's greatest weapon was not its guns or torpedoes, but the competence and courage of its men. And by the time Johnston deployed to the Pacific, the crew knew they had become something more than a ship. They were a weapon forged to strike first and strike hard. But no amount of training could change the reality of October 1944. USS Johnston was never meant to face a fleet like the center force. The destroyer weighed barely 1/30th of Yamato's displacement. Its thin steel plating could not stop a 5-inch shell, let alone the 18. 1-inch giants that Yamato hurled more than 20 miles. The ship carried only 10 torpedoes, a handful of 5-inch guns, and anti-aircraft weapons intended for defense, not offense. Its only advantages lay in speed, maneuverability, and the willingness of its captain to push both beyond sane limits. In contrast, Kurita's center force represented the remnants of Japan's once dominant battle fleet. Yamato, Nagato, Haruna, and several heavy cruisers, including Chikuma, Suzuya, and Kumano. Their guns were operated by veteran crews. Their armor had been designed to survive the heaviest hits imaginable. And their mission, under Operation SHO-1, was clear: break through the American screen, enter Leyte Gulf, and annihilate the transports supporting General MacArthur's invasion. They needed only a few hours to reach the vulnerable ships behind Taffy 3. Why then did this collision course occur? The answer lies in a chain of decisions made far beyond the horizon of Samar. After days of air attacks, American pilots reported that the center force had turned back. Many in 5th Fleet headquarters believed the Japanese retreat was permanent. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey, commanding the 3rd Fleet, saw an opportunity to destroy Ozawa's northern force, a group of Japanese carriers that still symbolized the enemy's naval prestige. Though these carriers had few planes left, their presence triggered Halsey's instincts. He took all of his fast battleships and carriers north, leaving San Bernardino Strait virtually unguarded. Only the Taffy's slow, lightly armed escort carrier groups remained in supporting positions. The risk seemed small. After all, the Japanese battleships were believed to be retreating. What Halsey did not know was that Kurita had not retreated at all. Shell-shocked from losing Musashi, his fleet had momentarily withdrawn, but then turned back toward the strait under cover of night. They passed through San Bernardino in darkness, undetected by American submarines and aircraft. When dawn arrived, Kurita expected to find Halsey's powerful carriers blocking his path. Instead, he saw 6 tiny escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Ships so light and slow that he initially assumed they must be the screen for a larger force, not the entire force itself. The men of Taffy 3 realized the scale of the threat only gradually. At 6:37, lookouts spotted high splashes, some rising more than 100 feet, far to the north. Battleship shells. Moments later, radar returns confirmed multiple large contacts. Then came the sight of pagoda masts and the unmistakable long hull of a battleship. Panic did not erupt, but disbelief spread. Many on Johnston had never seen a battleship up close. Now they were being targeted by at least 4. Within minutes, the escort carriers began launching everything they had: Avengers armed with depth charges, Wildcats with limited ammunition. None of these aircraft had been prepared for a naval surface battle. Most were configured for ground support over Leyte. Still, the carriers launched them, because to not launch was to die. In these first seconds of confusion, Evans understood something fundamental that others hesitated to accept. Running was not an option. The escort carriers could not outrun battleships. Taffy 3's formation could not hide behind terrain. The only path to survival was to disrupt, delay, and confuse the enemy long enough for the carriers to escape south. And the only ships capable of doing that were the destroyers, Johnston, Hull, and Heermann. Evans had 2 choices: protect his own ship by staying in formation, or sacrifice it to create chaos within the Japanese advance. He did not hesitate. He called for flank speed, ordered smoke deployed, and turned Johnston toward the enemy. When the ship surged forward, bucking against the waves as its engines roared to maximum output, the crew understood exactly what their captain intended to do. They would charge the most powerful battle fleet left in the Pacific. What drove Evans to this decision? He was not reckless nor suicidal. He simply recognized that the survival of Taffy 3 and the thousands of soldiers depending on their air cover required the destroyers to become a shield. As he later told the officers who questioned his orders, "If we don't knock out some of those big boys now, they'll get the carriers for sure." His sense of duty was personal, not abstract. When others saw an impossible situation, Evans saw only what had to be done. Among the crew, reactions varied from disbelief to grim determination. Gunners' mates checked ammunition. Torpedo men prepared the launch tubes. Signalmen climbed into exposed positions to maintain visual communication in case radios were knocked out. One sailor later recalled, "We knew we were dead men, but we were going to take as many of them with us as we could." That sentiment, repeated across the battle station reports, defined the next 2 hours of fighting. Meanwhile, aboard Kurita's flagship Yamato, officers struggled to interpret the American formation. Why were escort carriers attacking instead of fleeing? Why were destroyers charging instead of screening? Why were aircraft diving, even though they clearly lacked armor-piercing bombs? The answer, unknown to Kurita, was that these Americans were improvising with everything they had. And at the heart of that improvisation stood Ernest Edwin Evans, a man whose personal resolve would shape one of the most extraordinary naval actions in history. At 6:58 on October 25, 1944, the sea around Taffy 3 shifted from quiet gray to violent shrapnel blue as the first Japanese salvos landed. Towering columns of water, some nearly 150 feet high, erupted around the escort carriers, the blasts shaking their thin hulls as if struck by earthquakes. The concussion hammered through the decks of USS Fanshawe Bay and White Plains, blowing out porthole glass and rattling unsecured machinery. These were shells from battleships, huge 14-inch and 18-1-inch rounds traveling at supersonic speed, falling with enough force to tear an escort carrier in half. The men of Taffy 3 had trained for submarine threats, for kamikazes, for night raids. None had prepared for this, a direct gun duel with the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left. At 7 o'clock, with splashes marching steadily closer, Commander Evans watched the enemy formation tightening into a battle line. He understood the mathematics instantly. At their current range, the Japanese cruisers would find the escort carriers within minutes. He had to break their concentration. He keyed the bridge microphone and issued the order that defined the morning. Commence making smoke. Thick billows of gray-white smoke poured from Johnston's generators, spreading across the wind to cloak the carriers. The destroyer then accelerated hard, vibration tearing through her frame as she surged to 31 knots. Evans stood braced at the front of the bridge, one hand gripping the rail, eyes fixed on the horizon where Chikuma, Kumano, and a wall of pagoda masts loomed larger with every second. At 7:10, Johnston's forward 5-inch guns opened fire. The crew had drilled relentlessly for accuracy. Now the practice paid off. The first salvos fell short, but the gunners adjusted rapidly. By the fourth round, shells were bursting against the superstructure of the lead Japanese cruiser. Observers on Taffy 3 reported seeing flashes of impact along Kumano's bridge tower. Damage not catastrophic, but enough to disrupt fire control systems. For a moment, the Japanese line wavered. Kurita, peering from Yamato's armored conning tower, struggled to understand why a single destroyer was charging him at full speed, guns blazing. Then Johnston swung left, exposing her torpedo tubes, and the answer became clear. At 7:16, Evans ordered the torpedo run. The maneuver required steering straight toward the cruisers, closing to within a mile, well inside the killing range of every Japanese gun. Water geysers rose around the destroyer as heavy shells straddled her path, the blasts flinging spray across Evans's face. Down in the engine rooms, firemen shoved fuel into the boilers until the gauges screamed at their limits. On deck, torpedo men knelt beside their Mark 15 torpedoes, ready to fire on command. "Fire!" Evans shouted, and a moment later, 10 lethal white trails streaked across the waves toward the enemy column. Japanese lookouts saw them too late. Kumano, directly in the torpedo's path, heeled sharply to starboard to avoid destruction. The sudden maneuver tore open her bow as a torpedo or underwater shock ripped through the forward section. Her speed collapsed. She dropped out of formation, leaving a gap that threw the entire advance into disarray. Johnston, however, had paid a price. At 7:24, a Japanese battleship, believed to be Kongo or Haruna, found the range. A 14-inch shell slammed into Johnston's forward superstructure, blowing apart the bridge wing and sending shrapnel slicing across the open deck. The explosion showered Evans with fragments, wounding him in the face and shoulder. Several sailors were killed instantly. Yet the destroyer kept moving, engines still roaring. Evans, blood dripping down his cheek, wiped his eyes with his sleeve and shouted for increased speed. The men around him stared in disbelief. Their captain was injured, but his expression remained fiercely calm. The battle had only begun. Between 7:30 and 8 o'clock, the rest of Taffy 3's destroyers entered the fray. USS Hull surged forward first, weaving through the smoke to draw fire away from the carriers. She fired her torpedoes, forcing another group of cruisers to turn hard and lose formation. USS Herman followed, making a high-speed dash toward Yamato itself, a move so audacious that Japanese spotters mistook the destroyer for a larger ship. As these American tin cans darted and twisted across the waves, Taffy 3's destroyer escorts, Samuel B. Roberts, Raymond, Dennis, and John C. Butler, began firing their smaller 5-inch guns, bullets and shells rattling against the hulls of cruisers many times their size. They were hopelessly outgunned, but they fired anyway, because buying even a few extra seconds mattered. Overhead, at 7:45, the sky filled with the shapes of Avengers and Wildcats launching from the escort carriers. Many carried depth charges instead of armor-piercing bombs. Some carried nothing at all. Yet the pilots dove at the Japanese ships repeatedly, strafing bridges, winging torpedoes, and performing what became known as dry torpedo runs. Maneuvers where pilots pretended to release torpedoes simply to force cruisers to break formation. One pilot radioed, "I'm down to fumes, no ammo left," making another pass. Another, having dropped his last bomb, dove with empty racks and fired his pistol out the window, an act symbolic of the complete, desperate improvisation that now defined the battle. Meanwhile, Johnston, heavily damaged but still fighting, rejoined the action. At 8:20, engines laboring, communication lines shot away. She emerged from the smoke just as several Japanese cruisers were closing on the fleeing carriers. Recognizing the threat, Evans ordered his gunners to target Chikuma, one of the most dangerous Japanese ships. Johnston's guns roared again, each salvo shaking the crippled destroyer. The gunners, some bleeding from earlier shrapnel wounds, continued to fire with astonishing accuracy. Their shells struck Chikuma's aft turrets and superstructure, reducing her firepower and giving American aircraft an opening. Minutes later, Avengers from Kitkun Bay and Gamber Bay attacked the damaged cruiser, contributing to the series of blows that would eventually sink her. The counterattack came swiftly. At approximately 8:26, Johnston was hit again, this time by a 6-inch shell that tore into her port side, damaging the after-engine room and reducing her speed. Moments later, Japanese destroyers closed in, firing rapid bursts of medium-caliber shells. The destroyer escorts fought to protect her, but the onslaught was overwhelming. Smoke filled the passageways. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Yet the crew carried on loading shells, shouting bearings, and relaying messages by voice when electrical systems failed. Evans, still on the exposed bridge wing despite his wounds, refused to seek shelter. When an officer urged him to move indoors, he replied simply, "A destroyer skipper belongs on the bridge." Between 8:30 and 9 o'clock, the Japanese battle line began to falter. The combination of torpedo attacks, accurate gunnery, and unrelenting aircraft harassment sowed confusion across Kurita's fleet. Cruisers turned to avoid torpedoes, interrupting their own firing solutions. Battleships lost track of targets in the smoke. Reports frantically transmitted up the chain of command claimed the Americans were a fast carrier task force with large flat tops, a complete misinterpretation caused by the aggressiveness of Taffy 3's defense. Kurita hesitated. He had expected an easy breakthrough. Instead, he was fighting what appeared to be a determined battle group. At 9:10, Johnston's luck ran out. A cluster of Japanese destroyers closed from the east, their guns pounding the already crippled ship. The destroyer shook with each impact. The forward guns jammed. One engine died. Still, the starboard 5-inch gun continued firing manually, the last functioning heavy weapon on the ship. Sailors fed shells into the breach by hand, their faces blackened by smoke. Through the chaos, Johnston turned again toward the enemy, still trying to shield the carriers. Evans never considered surrender. When the helm jammed, he had men steer manually from aft steering. When the radios died, he used runners. When the ammunition dwindled, he ordered the crew to fire until the barrels overheated. By 9:45, Johnston was dead in the water. Fires raged through the midship section. Ammunition lockers flooded. The ship listed heavily to port. Evans gave the quiet order to abandon ship. Survivors later recalled his final moments, standing at the rail, calmly directing evacuation efforts, refusing to leave the sinking destroyer. As men slid into the oil-slicked water, Johnston finally rolled onto her side and slid beneath the waves. Of her 327 crewmen, nearly half would never be seen again. But their sacrifice had bought priceless time. Kurita, bewildered by the ferocity of the American defense and convinced he faced a much larger force, ordered his fleet to break off the attack. At 9:20, amid smoke, confusion, and fear of incoming torpedo bombers, he abruptly turned away. The path to Leyte Gulf, wide open just hours before, was closed. Taffy 3, battered beyond recognition, had stopped the most powerful surface fleet Japan had put to sea since Pearl Harbor. When the guns finally fell silent over the waters east of Samar, the battle did not end with triumphant cheers or the rising sun of victory. It ended with drifting oil slicks, floating debris, wounded sailors clinging to life rafts, and the stunned realization that the impossible had happened. A tiny, hopelessly outgunned task unit had turned back one of the largest surface fleets ever deployed by Japan. By late morning on October 25, 1944, the surviving escort carriers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 limped south to regroup with Taffy 2 and seek medical aid. The waves behind them were littered with fragments of tin cans, sections of hull plating, twisted torpedo racks, scorched plywood from carrier decks, and the silent bodies of men who had stood their ground in the face of overwhelming firepower. Among them were many crewmen of USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Samuel B. Roberts, ships that had fought until their magazines were empty and their engines drowned beneath the sea. The losses were staggering: Johnston gone, Hull gone, Samuel B. Roberts gone, Gamber Bay, the only American carrier sunk by naval gunfire in history, gone. Casualties exceeded 1,000 men across the Taffy units, with many more wounded. And yet, despite this destruction, the strategic outcome was unmistakable. The transports in Leyte Gulf remained untouched, the beachhead secure, and the entire American invasion of the Philippines. Hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, saved by the actions of a handful of outmatched vessels. In contrast, Kurita's fleet, though still possessing several battleships and cruisers, had lost momentum, cohesion, and most critically, confidence. During the chaotic withdrawal, multiple Japanese heavy cruisers suffered grave damage from American aircraft that continued to harass them as they retreated. Chikuma, battered earlier by Johnston and subsequent airstrikes, sank later that day. Suzuya, hit repeatedly and suffering internal explosions from her own torpedoes, also sank. Kumano, already crippled by torpedoes launched during the early destroyer attacks, would survive the day but succumb weeks later to American carrier aircraft. The center force was reduced from a terrifying battle armada to a disorganized group of isolated vessels. It no longer had the strength, or the will, to challenge American naval superiority. Though Japan still had ships, it lacked the fuel, coordination, and experienced commanders to mount any further large-scale surface operations. Samar marked the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy would confront the U.S. Navy in a major gun battle. The Japanese High Command was left stunned by the outcome. After the war, Japanese officers admitted that the ferocity of the American defense convinced them they were facing a full carrier task group. The aggression of the destroyers and the relentless air attacks sowed so much confusion that Kurita believed he was being baited into a larger trap. His decision to retreat has been debated ever since, some calling it a failure of resolve, others noting that he had been denied vital intelligence, battered by previous air attacks, and operating in a fog of contradictory reports. But one thing became clear. The men of Taffy 3 fought so far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect that they distorted the enemy's perception of reality. Their sacrifice created an illusion of strength that did not exist, and that illusion saved an entire invasion. For the Americans, the aftermath was both heroic and heartbreaking. Survivors spent hours in shark-infested waters before rescue ships arrived. Many clung to rafts under the scorching sun, wounded and exhausted, recounting the last commands of their officers or the final shots fired from their guns. Those pulled from the sea spoke of Commander Ernest Evans with reverence and sorrow. They described how he had stood on the bridge, even when wounded, even when Johnston was losing power, shouting orders to keep firing and maneuvering. They described how, when the ship could fight no longer, he stayed behind to oversee evacuation, refusing to abandon his men. Evans was never seen again. He went down with Johnston, fulfilling the ancient naval code he had lived by since his academy days. In 1945, Commander Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to receive such recognition. His citation read like the script of an impossible tale: charging a superior enemy, launching torpedoes at point-blank range, attacking repeatedly despite severe damage, inspiring his crew to fight until the ship sank beneath them. Other ships of Taffy 3 received Presidential Unit citations. Many individual acts of valor were recognized, though countless unnamed sacrifices were lost to the depths. The legacy of Samar reached far beyond medals. It changed American naval doctrine, highlighting the critical role of improvisation, rapid decision-making, and the psychological impact of aggressive action. It cemented the belief that even small ships, wielded boldly, could disrupt and deter enormous enemy formations. It also reinforced the importance of reconnaissance and accurate intelligence. The failure to track Kurita's movement through San Bernardino Strait became a cautionary example studied by naval officers for generations. For historians, Samar remains one of the most astonishing episodes of the Pacific War, a moment when courage, instinct, and desperation collided to shape history. The story grew even more remarkable in 2019 and 2021, when deep-sea expeditions located the shattered remains of USS Johnston on the ocean floor, resting more than 20,000 feet down. The images revealed her forward 5-inch guns still pointed toward the horizon, as if ready to fire. The discovery brought closure to families, survivors, and naval historians. It confirmed what the men who fought there already knew. The destroyer had not retreated, had not faltered, and had not surrendered. She had fought until the sea claimed her, and even now, in the silent darkness of the deep, she still faced the direction from which the enemy came. Taffy 3's legacy survives not because of the tonnage of ships or the number of guns, but because of the magnitude of will displayed by ordinary men placed in extraordinary circumstances. Their resistance at Samar was not a calculated maneuver or a textbook operation. It was the sum of countless individual decisions, each sailor choosing, again and again, to stand his ground, to fire one more shell, to dive one more time, to believe that his actions mattered even if the odds were hopeless. The invasion of the Philippines continued. The war pressed on. But for those who were there, the battle off Samar became a defining moment, a testament to what bravery looks like when there is no chance of victory, only the chance to save others. In the end, the battle off Samar was not defined by steel, firepower, or the cold arithmetic of naval warfare. It was defined by choice. Choices made in seconds, under unbearable pressure, by men who knew they were outmatched yet fought as though victory depended on them alone. At 7:24 that morning, when Commander Ernest Evans turned his 2,100-ton destroyer toward nearly 300,000 tons of Japanese battleships and cruisers, he made a decision that defied logic but honored duty. And every moment afterward, every torpedo launched, every gun fired, every pilot who dove with empty bomb racks, every sailor who stayed at his post as shells tore through steel, flowed from that single, impossible choice. The question that opened this story still echoes. Why would a destroyer charge the largest battleship ever built? The answer lies not in strategy or doctrine, but in something deeper. The belief that even a small ship, even a single crew, can change the fate of thousands if they refuse to yield. Taffy 3 did not win a traditional victory at Samar. They lost ships, men, and heroes whose names only history now speaks aloud. But they won the only victory that mattered. They stopped the enemy long enough to save an entire invasion force and helped seal the fate of an empire already collapsing under the weight of its ambitions. Today, the story of Samar endures not because of statistics, but because it forces us to confront the human core of war. If we find ourselves facing impossible odds, what do we stand for? If the horizon darkens with giants, do we turn away, or turn toward them, as Evans did? As you reflect on the courage of those men, share their story, remember their sacrifice, and ask yourself the final question. In their place, with the sea shaking beneath your feet and the sky split by fire, what choice would you make?